You know, um, that image, right, the one we've all seen countless times, a Native American woman with a baby on her back. It's etched into the U.S. dollar coin.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
That baby is Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau.
Yeah.
And while most of us probably know his mother, Sacagawea's story, from the Lewis and Clark expedition, what about what happened to Jean-Baptiste after that?
Right.
Today we're going on a deep dive into his life, a life that went far beyond just that one iconic image.
For sure.
And we'll be drawing primarily from a recent episode of the Noble Blood podcast for this one.
Sounds good.
So it's pretty amazing how one single image can overshadow a whole life story, right?
Yeah, it really is.
Jean-Baptiste's journey takes us from the early days of American exploration to the grand halls of European aristocracy, and then back again to the rugged American West.
Yeah, it's a story full of twists and turns that you really wouldn't expect.
So before we jump into the lesser-known parts of his life, let's do a super quick recap, just in case. You know the Lewis and Clark expedition, right? It was commissioned by President Thomas Jefferson. It was a monumental journey to explore the newly acquired Louisiana Purchase.
Right.
Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman, was there. She played a crucial role as a guide and interpreter, and her infant son Jean-Baptiste was with her every step of the way.
And it's important to remember that Jean-Baptiste's presence on the expedition wasn't just symbolic.
Yeah.
As the podcast points out, Lewis and Clark specifically noted in their journals that having a woman and a child with them actually helped to ease tensions with the Native American tribes that they encountered along the way.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, it signaled that they weren't a war party, which was, crucial for their safety and the expedition's success.
That's a good point. And it's fascinating to look at some of those journal entries, like William Clark, for example. He developed a real fondness for Jean-Baptiste. He even nicknamed him Pomp.
Ah,
He went so far as to offer to raise and educate the boy.
wow.
That offer, while it seems benevolent on the surface, does open up a whole conversation about the complexities of the time.
Yeah.
This was an era where the idea of, civilizing Native American children was very prevalent.
Right.
Taking them away from their families and cultures was seen as the, quote unquote, right way
Yeah.
to assimilate them into white society.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the context that we have to keep in mind. When we consider what happened next, after the expedition, Sacagawea and Toussaint Charbonneau, Jean-Baptiste's father, settled in St. Louis.
Mm.
But tragically, the historical record regarding Sacagawea's life after that is very unclear.
Right.
The Noble Blood podcast suggests that she most likely died in 1812, maybe from putrid fever.
Oh, wow.
And after this, Toussaint, who had already taken another young Native American woman, Otter Woman, as a second wife, gave custody of Jean-Baptiste and his younger sister, Lizette, to Clark.
Oh, wow.
And sadly, Lizette's fate is a mystery.
Yeah.
But it's assumed that she probably died young. And as for Toussaint, he went on to marry several more times. Always to teenage Native American girls.
Oh, my gosh.
This definitely adds a layer of complexity to his character,
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
And it kind of makes you question the, traditional narrative surrounding it.
Definitely.
But going back to Jean-Baptiste, Clark enrolled him in a boarding school,
Okay.
fulfilling that earlier promise. Now, while we can't know for sure what his motives were, it's essential to view his actions through the lens of that time period. He might have genuinely cared for Jean-Baptiste, but his decision also reflects those prevailing colonial attitudes.
Absolutely.
It goes to show how history is rarely black and white, right?
Okay.
Full of nuance and conflicting perspectives,
Yeah.
and actions that can be interpreted in multiple ways, especially when we're dealing with things like cultural clashes and power dynamics.
Yeah, for sure.
And speaking of cultural clashes, this is where Jean-Baptiste's story takes a truly unexpected turn. At just 16 years old, while living in Kansas, he encountered Duke Paul Wilhelm of Württemberg. He was a German prince with a thirst for adventure and a rather unusual hobby, collecting.
Collected.
The Duke wasn't just collecting artifacts, though. He was fascinated by the New World, and it seemed like he was collecting experiences, too.
Interesting.
He had already hired Toussaint as a guide during his travels through America. And when he met Jean-Baptiste, who was already somewhat famous because of his connection to the Lewis and Clark expedition, well, he saw an opportunity. And he invited Jean-Baptiste to return to Europe with him.
Wow. Imagine that.
Right. Going from the American frontier to the heart of European aristocracy.
Yeah, that's quite a culture shock.
That's a culture shock for sure. They spent 6 years together,
Mm-hmm.
with Jean-Baptiste living in the Duke's palace, traveling through Europe, and even venturing as far as Africa and Australia.
Wow.
But the nature of their relationship, That's where things get a little murky.
Okay.
Was it genuine friendship? Was it more of a mentorship? Or was Jean-Baptiste more like an exotic specimen in the Duke's collection? The Noble Blood podcast really digs into this ambiguity,
Hmm.
and they point out the lack of primary sources from Jean-Baptiste's perspective.
Right.
Many of the Duke's journals were destroyed during World War II. So all we can really do is piece together the story from fragments and interpretations.
So it's like trying to solve a puzzle, but you don't have all the pieces.
Exactly. We get these little glimpses,
Okay.
like accounts of Jean-Baptiste learning languages, exploring the Black Forest, honing his hunting skills alongside the Duke.
Okay.
But as the podcast points out, Professor Albert Fehringer, a historian who has studied the Duke extensively, suggests there's little evidence that the Duke really viewed Jean-Baptiste as a true equal.
Yeah.
He says the lack of personal writings by the Duke about Jean-Baptiste might actually suggest that he was seen more as a novelty and not really a genuine friend.
Oh, that's sad.
And right before leaving Europe, Jean-Baptiste fathered a child with Anastasia Katerina Fry, the daughter of a soldier. The baby Anton Fry sadly died shortly after birth, adding another layer of mystery and sadness to his story. It's like we're peering through a fragmented window into the past. We see these intriguing pieces, but the full picture just remains elusive.
Yeah.
So at the age of 25, Jean-Baptiste returned to America, leaving behind that opulent world of the European courts for the, rugged life of the Western frontier.
Oh, wow.
It's almost like his life had come full circle, but this time he was returning as a man,
Yeah.
shaped by experiences that very few people could even imagine.
Yeah. It's here back in the American West where we see another shift in Jean-Baptiste's story.
Okay.
He didn't shy away from the challenges of frontier life.
No,
He really seemed to embrace them.
really.
Yeah, he joined fur trading companies,
Wow.
navigating that whole world of bartering and trade.
Yeah.
Picture him like knee-deep in snow, haggling over beaver pelts in some, remote trading post.
That's a far cry from the elegant drawing rooms of Europe.
Right.
Totally. The podcast also mentions that he hunted buffalo,
Oh, wow.
a skill that he likely honed during his time with the Duke.
Oh, that's cool.
And he even served as a guide for various expeditions,
Oh, wow.
including one for a Scottish baronet.
Really?
Yeah, it seems like adventure was just in his blood.
Yeah, definitely. And his life continued to intersect with major historical events, too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like he fought in the Mexican-American War,
Wow.
a conflict that really reshaped the map of North America.
Yeah.
And later he even served as an alcalde in California during the gold rush.
What's that alcalde?
Oh, an alcalde was essentially like a mayor
Okay.
responsible for upholding law and order in a, booming, often chaotic gold mining town.
So, wow. Talk about a diverse resume.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how some historians viewed this period of his life.
Yeah.
The podcast mentions Grace Hurd, who wrote about Jean-Baptiste in the 1930s.
Okay.
She actually saw his frontier life as a sort of deterioration,
Deterioration.
like a failure to live up to the, civilized potential that he'd supposedly gained in Europe.
It's a perspective that I think reveals more about the biases of the time than about Jean-Baptiste himself. This idea that Native American culture was inherently inferior to European culture was so ingrained in the thinking of many historians back then. They just couldn't reconcile his choice to live a rugged frontier life with the education and the experiences that he'd had in Europe.
Yeah, it's almost as if they expected him to return from Europe and become some sort of refined gentleman scholar,
Right.
completely shedding his Native American identity.
Yeah,
It's a good reminder that history is often written through a very specific lens.
precisely.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder how Jean-Baptiste himself viewed these different aspects of his own identity.
Yeah,
He was a man who really straddled multiple worlds,
totally.
Native American and even European to some extent.
Right.
Did he see them as conflicting or complementary? Unfortunately, without more primary sources from his own hand, we're just left to speculate.
That's true. But the Noble Blood podcast does offer a counterpoint to Grace Hurd's interpretation. They share an anecdote about a Native American trapper who chooses the treasures and realities of the wilderness over what's considered civilized life.
Okay.
And although they don't definitively say that it was Jean-Baptiste, it's heavily implied.
Mm-hmm.
It's a romantic notion, isn't it?
Yeah.
The idea of, rejecting the trappings of European society for a simpler, more authentic existence in nature.
For sure.
It taps into that fascination with the idealized image of the American West,
Totally.
the rugged individual living off the land.
Yeah, but even if that trapper in the anecdote wasn't Jean-Baptiste, it raises an interesting question.
What's that?
What did a fulfilling life look like for someone like him?
Right.
Someone who'd experienced such vastly different worlds.
Yeah,
Was it even possible to integrate those experiences, or was he constantly pulled between them?
that's a good question.
Yeah, those are questions worth pondering.
For sure.
And they highlight the challenge of interpreting history.
Right.
We have these fragments, these glimpses into a life, but ultimately the full picture remains elusive.
You know, it's up to us to consider the different perspectives, the different possibilities, and to just acknowledge the limitations of our knowledge.
I like that. And perhaps that's the most valuable takeaway from Jean-Baptiste's story.
Yeah.
You know, he defies easy categorization.
Yeah.
He was a symbol, a survivor, an adventurer.
Right.
He reminds us that history isn't just about dates and battles,
No,
but about the messy, complicated lives of individuals.
absolutely. And sometimes those individual stories challenge the grand narratives, the simplified versions of history that we often cling to.
Totally.
They force us to look closer, to ask more questions, and to just embrace the ambiguity.
I love that. So we're reaching the end of Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau's journey, and we find him in Oregon,
Well-
a place that was still really the edge of the frontier in the mid-1800s.
Yeah.
He died there in 1866
Oh, wow.
after falling from his horse into an icy river.
Oh, God.
And the town where he died is actually a ghost town now,
Wow.
but his grave remains.
Marking the final resting place of a life that was anything but ordinary.
And it's in that final resting place that I think we really confront the so what of Jean-Baptiste's story.
Yeah.
Why does this matter to us today? You know, beyond the inherent fascination with a life that really spanned continents and cultures.
I think for me, it's a reminder that history isn't just something we read about in textbooks or see in statues.
Right.
It's made up of real people with their own, experiences and choices,
Yeah.
their triumphs and their heartbreaks.
Yeah.
And Jean-Baptiste's life, I think, challenges us to look beyond those simplified narratives and really grapple with the complexities.
I agree. His life intersects with all these major historical events.
Yeah.
The Lewis and Clark expedition, westward expansion, the gold rush.
Right.
But his personal experience adds this layer of nuance and depth that you just don't get from those broader historical accounts.
That's true.
It's a reminder that there are always multiple perspectives, untold stories, just waiting to be unearthed.
Absolutely. And I think there's a really powerful message about identity, too. Jean-Baptiste was constantly navigating all these different worlds, these different cultures.
For sure.
He was a child of the Shoshone, shaped by the American frontier, exposed to the grandeur of Europe,
Right.
but ultimately chose to make his life in the American West.
Yeah.
So his story kind of prompts us to ask, how do we define ourselves when our identities are so multifaceted?
It's a question that's incredibly relevant today,
Well,
in our increasingly interconnected world.
Yeah.
How do we reconcile our own individual stories with the larger forces of history and culture?
Right.
How do we find a sense of belonging when our identities are so fluid and complex?
In Jean-Baptiste's story, it doesn't really give us easy answers,
No.
but it does give us a starting point, I think,
Yeah.
for these really important conversations.
Yeah, for sure.
It encourages us to embrace the messy, the contradictory, the unknown aspects of history and identity.
And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that every life, no matter how seemingly insignificant or forgotten,
Yeah.
has a story worth telling.
That's powerful.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what other forgotten figures are out there, just waiting for us to uncover their stories and learn from their experiences.
It's a great question.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the life of Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, we'll leave you with this thought.
Okay.
What hidden stories are waiting to be discovered in your own community? Maybe in your own family history? What forgotten figures deserve a second look? It's time to dig a little deeper, uncover the unexpected, and challenge the narratives we thought we knew. Happy exploring.
I like that.